Welcome back to the show. Today we have Dr. Kevin Fleming. He's the founder of Gray Matters International. Kevin, welcome to the show.
Welcome. It's good to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you back on the show. You did the radio version and, that's kind of a longer interview of some of the stuff we're going to cover today. But maybe before we get into what we're going to talk about today, let's get to know you a little bit better and start off with where you grew up.
Sure. I'm a Northeast guy. I grew up in Western Massachusetts, so I'm very happy currently right now with my Red Sox. That's probably going to be out of date by the time everybody sees this, but hanging in there with the Astros, by the way, so that's good. But yeah, Western Massachusetts, did my schooling at Notre Dame, spent many years there, the whole 90s there, bachelor's, master's, PhD there, and then went off to do a little residency, postdoc at Wyoming, and then started my entrepreneurial work right after that, getting into some health coaching kind of endeavors, a company that did we hooked up with self-insured entities and helped them lower down their premiums for the chronically ill employees.
Interesting.
Yeah, it was a really nice venture because it really taught me sort of that, that bottom line piece that, your shrinky kind of ideas are great and all, but they better lead to some serious change in the pocketbooks and in people's lives. And so that kind of just was a great ground floor for the launch of Gray Matters and the thinking and the philosophy behind that.
Sure. So what exactly is Gray Matters and why did you actually decide to create your own thing?
Yeah, so Gray Matters, I always kind of intro this as sort of saying it's somewhere between two kind of paradigms of thought right now in terms of the assumptive base of what I'm doing. And on one side, you got the clinical psychology, therapy, counseling kind of mental health or medical mental health model. Psychiatric drugs, counseling therapy, psychotherapy, things like that to help a bunch of psychological disorders. Very reasonable, good for some people some of the time in some ways, in my opinion, definitely have value. And then you have on the other side, you have the growing coaching field, the personal development field, whether that's executive coaching, life coaching, advisors, thought leaders, business and non-business, whatever that entity is. These are to me, those are the kind of camps out there for developing human behavior or developing human beings and changing human behavior and things like that. Gray Matters I think my company saw early on sort of some half truths on both sides. And mainly because I wore hats on both sides, right? So I can kind of see what worked and what didn't. And on the clinical psych side, what it realized was very good at relationship building, communication skills, kindness, compassion, connection, emotional intelligence, supposedly, but it definitely like being in a very, relationship-driven kind of way of getting change. That to me, eventually, I learned that was maybe a necessary but not sufficient condition to change, right? So you could have a bunch of people coming into your office who say words of change. I want to change this. I'm suffering. I'm hurting. I'd like this to shift or be different. But what you'd find is they were at a different stage of change, or their goal for the change process was what we call a first order kind of mechanism. So it was more around a symptomatic reliefs without kind of radically changing their assumption. It's very different to lower depressive symptoms from a first order side than the second order side. The person that comes in from a second order change perspective are looking for you to radically blow up their assumptions and to feel uncomfortable and under a little bit of distress for good reasons. And I couldn't make that assumption many times in the clinical side. And I think I'm saying that's wrong, but I just enjoy doing more of the bolder radical dialogues of change. So the coaching profession comes along, as we know, in the past 10, 20 years and says, wow, gee, all you clinical guys and gals are doing a little bit too much on this pathology and negativity and what's wrong with people. There's a lot of things that are good. Let's grow the good and the strengths. Again, sounds reasonable to me. Again, I think a necessary but not sufficient condition to the puzzle of change. And so the coaching field, in my opinion, is wrought with similar kind of or different issues, like just people not as qualified in the science piece behind human behavior, some ethics issues in terms of how people conceptualize a problem, whether it's an individual, a team, or a corporate culture. There's a lot of dysfunction and disorder there that does need a psychological lens, and they can miss that a bit. in my opinion. And I think an overdoing of motivation, right? As sort of just like it's a rational model of if you just kind of get motivated, know your goals, set boundaries, or do whatever you need to do, you can achieve anything you put your mind to. That kind of model, I think, has some limitations. So Gray Matters International really kind of put those two together and said, hey, listen, let's take the best of clinical psych background in terms of relationship building and understanding of human behavior, and let's put a whole nother paradigm of developmental kind of orientations of change, and then sprinkle on top a bit of neuroscience and cognitive neuroscience and neurotechnologies and a lot of innovations that we have now that really go into irrationality of human behavior when words don't matter as much or don't seem to be getting people to change. What does that mean? Does it mean we're just over here in pathology land and need medicine, or does it mean that we're all, as Dan Ariely would say, predictably irrational? Are there some aspects of us that are eccentric, odd, and influenced by other factors that we may never have access to? That's really what I love. Gray Matters International is a high performance zone working with entrepreneurs, executives, distinctive clients who just don't either fit psychotherapy or the traditional model of coaching and really want best practice science to transform. And then it's also for their spouses and their kids and their family lives and their private lives as well.
No, that's interesting, because I think, at least in my case, or kind of my thoughts on the whole thing is, I don't really necessarily care which vertical it falls in. I just want you to help me with the issue that I have, right? And if that needs, whatever that needs, let's figure that out together, right? And I think part of the problem is being open to actually changing that behavior, right? Or because obviously it's probably really hard sometimes to get somebody to be able to say, look, this is what I want you help with, and then be willing to actually work on changing that. Because that can in itself can be kind of scary and hard to change, right?
Well, yes, and no doubt. And it's scary and hard to change, even when you think you have an idea of what the it is that you have to go after. Now take that level of self-courage and kind of go it up 2 or 3 or 4 notches when someone puts up something that's very coveted or self-protected in your psyche and your sacredness and says, no, that's actually a problem, Joe. Oh, wait, that's how I built my self-esteem and how people praise me for that. You telling me? Now we'll see if your words, Kevin, that you just gave me are really true, right? And that's definitely the issue when you're dealing with successful people, because many of the things that we have to work on are the things that they're rewarded on many times in their day-to-day lives. They achieved a much ego status and accolades. And so what happens to the brain at this point is the dopaminergic reward circuitry starts coding and understanding and predicting those types of enhancing kind of things to do in your life. And you end up sort of not knowing the tipping point, and you flood your brain engine, so to speak, with too much of dopamine, and the other neurotransmitters can't seem to keep up. And you end up with this confusion that is really a big chunk of my work, which is when success and happiness don't really jive anymore, or even worse, when they become diametrically opposed to each other. That's even more frightening for these folks who have a wonderful story of success and find out that something maybe has to change deep in them to keep everything else they love supposedly as well. And it's very, very challenging.
Yeah. So walk me through that a little bit, because it's always kind of fascinated me that even in myself, and I've done it too, where you think if I achieve this, whatever that is, that will be like happy, or like if I make X amount of dollars or something like that. Mm-hmm. But they're not related at all, really, from what I've read anyway, or what I've understood to be true.
No, you're correct. Actually, I think I think this research still holds, and folks out there can probably correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the relationship between money and happiness, and again, loosely defined in some subjective experience of well-being, it's a 1-to-1 correlation, really, only till around 50,000 a year. It's remarkable. Then the relationship gets, I think, a bit asymptotic after that. Levels off a bit. I don't know what 6-figure number, but it's very low 6 figures. It kind of starts getting a little bit, the return on your investment, so to speak, for each dollar earned gets smaller and smaller. And then there is this drop off. There's a strong drop off where it's an inverse, and it's disastrous. So it's really interesting to me, because everything about our culture is past the 1-to-1 correlation point. I think most college grads start way above 50 grand. So they're already starting behind the 8 ball. right?
Interesting.
So it's very interesting to me that kind of removing the chains and and it's all, and it's having a radical effect on the brain. And there is something that behavioral economists call the hedonic treadmill, right? And so this is sort of meaning the things that you were mentioning, all these things that we were trained to believe are the things to happiness aren't, because what ends up happening, like a treadmill, we keep moving and it needs to go faster, and it keeps you're never off of it. So what felt like success at one point, once you achieve it, it keeps moving. It won't actually feel like that same objective parameter. And we see this too with kids, these 20 somethings or even teenagers who are starting to kind of conceptualize the vision of their life, what they're wanting. I mean, there was a day when I'm not sure how old you are,
35.
but back when I was 35, back when we were younger, you would hear articulations and narratives of futures being things like, I want to have a certain trade or craft or learn a specialty skill. And even if you were a white collar smarty pantsy kind of person, you were thinking doctors, lawyers, some kind of, whatever. Now what you hear a lot more of wanting to be liked. I want to have the corner office and the gold watch. I want to be a CEO. These are very interesting statements. They want things that are sort of like emotional, ancillary, protective, sort of pleasure-based things around a certain lifestyle, but they put those things that are supposed to be environmentally based in the center and then work around that. So everything's reversed, and it's, in my opinion. And so you have a very challenging time trying to get identity questions answered, wisdom kind of things looked at, philosophy, good thinking. All these things get very challenging for a culture that has needle in the vein all the time.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think even just talking to a bunch of really kind of successful people, even on the show, I think they still feel kind of lost or a fraud or, like they don't belong where they are. So it makes sense that younger people are feeling the same way. But I think the thing that they're missing is there's people that have been hugely successful that feel the exact same way that are maybe 20 or 30 years older than them. Is that fair to say?
Oh yeah, no, I think I'm not sure of the thought leader who came up with the book or the phrase, but the imposter syndrome is actually a book, and it's right, and it's written for these C-levels and executives who feel like someone's going to find out that they're unqualified for where they really are, and it's this chronic state of, and I see this now with a lot of my clients. It's just an internal anxiety. Now, I'm not talking kind of the panic attack kind of stuff, which of course for some it is big and it is a severe feeling. It's horrible. But there is this sort of almost like existential anxiety that seems to be an undercurrent to our world. And and it's exacerbated by lack of sleep and boundaryless stuff and things like that. And what happens is you end up kind of not sleeping well. You end up not having the right types of balancing self-care issues in your life. And so you end up kind of you get used to this chronic restlessness and you end up self-medicating. So another key area we work on a lot is addiction, or at least compulsive patterns of behavior that aren't healthy. This is a big area now because, and I don't know if I mentioned this in our radio interview, but there was I think a neurobiologist out of Stanford, Sapolsky is his name, wrote a great book called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. And he was basically saying, listen, a zebra is either eaten by the lion on the savannah or he runs away, so that primal survival instinct of fight, flight, or freeze can kick in and it's resolved. So the switch is either on or off fairly quickly. What happens now, because of this chronic ill at ease anxiety that's sort of just a given, it's like a white noise underneath a lot of our desire to achieve at all costs, is we end up flipping that switch on and stay stuck because urgency, the idea of information that we need to process and work with and decide from, is always coming at us. Well, at some point the brain just says, okay, that's urgent. That's a red alarm kind of thing. So life death situations start now getting coded in just forms of like informational urgency. That stays on, that switch, which means cortisol dumps at the hippocampus go up, brain derived neurotropic factor goes down. We seem to see a lot of neuroplastic changes because of the stress and the burnout. And again, all insidious. It's never kind of like, hey, I'm a big problem in your life. Hi, how are you? Could you let me into your life? No, thanks. It doesn't happen that way. it's always behind something that's coveted and accepted and good and virtuous and rewarded.
Yeah. And it's interesting how, as you progress in your career and you're growing in your career, everybody has a set of problems.
Yeah.
They're different problems, right? Even like the wealthiest person on the planet, which is probably Jeff Bezos at this point recording this, he still
Right.
has issues, right? Like there's
Yeah.
problems that he has, good, bad, or other. So they're just different problems, right? And I think people forget that once you attain something, well, it's just a different set of problems, right?
Correct. Well, it is. And it's because when we look at the construct of happiness, which, as you know, is such a big thing now, it's sexy to talk about happiness and study it. And even though I got to say, one of the best quotes that I've ever heard on happiness is in the waiting room of happiness. Gosh, I love that quote, because it's basically saying, let's get our cause and effect parts of the variables in the equation correct, because you don't go after happiness to get it. And that's a big piece that's missing, but it's what you're alluding to. The definition of happiness is a relative construct. Actually, it evolves, and we see this with like a lot of my trader clients that obviously can make a lot and lose a lot. The remarkable effects on the brain from a mental health perspective during a perceived loss, even if the loss drops them from 6 million to 4.5. We would see the 4.5 from the outside as it being enough, but it's perceived loss, right? It's always in contrast. And any type of, we know this from loss aversion, we are more motivated to prevent the loss than necessarily to grow the gain in a long-term sustainable way. And so when you're oriented that way, your thinking is going to be skewed, and you have to kind of be at least aware that is the case. But now you're hitting on ego stuff, and that's hard.
Yeah, no, that's fair. I think that's part of the problem that you probably find a lot, is like just getting somebody's ego in check, right?
It's a tough one. I like to say that there are two types of clients that come my way. One is the sort of these clients that are just hardwired for tire kicking. Like they've gotten to a certain level, and they do get sort of psychologically naked, so to speak, very easily. And there isn't a challenge, a threat, a conversation that takes them off kilter. They will go to the radical levels to kick their thinking. That's, to be honest, that's a smaller subset from a transformational human being subset. That is, it just is. Most of the clients that will find their way through the doors of Gray Matters are either through the spouse, because there's some troubles going on at home where, hey, wait a minute, it's time to look at this all of a sudden because the wife is finding out about some illicit behavior and I've got to do something. Or a board member can call, or a chairman of company, to say, hey, listen, we've got a very talented person who's imploding a bit. We got to keep them, help us do that. There's a lot of discrete need going on here in terms of how we work with this person. So let's come on in and bring your tools where he can do it easily. Or family business, you'll have a lot of issues like that with family business. But in general, all these scenarios are the second camp, which is, oh crap, it's, blanks hit the fan. It's time to change. And it's just the sad part of humanity. Pain is a big motivator. It's just what we do with it when it happens that matters. And self-deceiving properties of the brain start kicking in. And before we know it, we can end up thinking we're changing when we're really not.
Yeah, that's quite fascinating, actually. So how did you get involved with CBS's Face the Truth?
Oh yeah, so there was that was a great opportunity of I like the concept of the show, by the way. I'm not sure if you've seen it, but it's a bunch of sort of different types of minds, that are analyzing a situation, a legal, a coaching oriented, a clinical psych person. They're all kind of analyzing a situation and putting a guest all together, or putting the client's story or a guest story, right on the front of these experts, and giving different opinions to it. So you don't just have sort of a one size fits all answer. It's really unique. And I guess this show comes from Dr. Phil's and the doctor's executive producing team, which is kind of nice. But yeah, they just had a guest that they needed some aftercare work with, that we were going to offer a complimentary service after they did the intervention. And they picked my company to do that. And they asked if I would be, open to possibility of doing more of that. And so, yeah, it's been a really nice opportunity to be partnering with those guys.
No, that's great, man. And congrats on that. 'Cause that's a huge deal, right?
Yeah,
So
it's nice.
So walk me through how you actually work with people. From what I understand, you actually will physically go to somebody kind of basically wherever, right?
Yeah, yeah. Right now, client wise, we can be in 5 continents in one point. But obviously, it's just mostly me that does a lot of the work. I have some associates that help with some of the other backside pieces. But yeah, so the engagement really obviously depends on the presenting issue. But most of the time, I'm old school, right? So I like. There's nothing better than a handshake and look in the eyes and get an assessment and get a good sort of intensive. We use the word intensive at Gray Matters, an intensive over 3 or 4 days, so we can get a full workup, assessment wise, marriage wise, if they want me to get into the private life a little bit, or just on the corporate leadership piece or executive development. We can do a whole bunch of testing, interviewing, facilitations. And then even at times neurotechnology. Some of the people that are really hurting, that have some impulsivity issues or mood issues, we got some amazing tools from our side, and we'll kick off as much change as we can within the shortest period of time. That's my whole model, because attrition's a problem with this population. They're so busy, they may not show up again, and so you want to make sure that you're getting the brain, the mind, the body, the thinking sets to kind of shift as much as possible. And if you have to challenge, you challenge. Assuming readiness for the client, you're challenging hard right out of the gate, because you don't know how much you have. So starts with that, and then depending on the severity and the chronicity of the issue, either just transition to just virtual support, and all my coaching work is 24/7 access, phone, text, email, Skype when they need it, which can be challenging for the international folks, challenging for me. Or if it's an ongoing thing, then maybe once a month we'll do a didactic, a little skills camp, a little boot camp kind of thing, to keep the skill training and the coaching and the facilitation live, kind of in the moment for them. Keep that going. And yeah, I will fly to locations so as they need me and plug in and build a plan for like 6 months if they need it, or just the retreat on the front end.
No, I think that's interesting, right? Because I think a lot of people want something that's tailored to them, like we kind of mentioned earlier in the show. And I think sometimes I'm guessing here, and you can tell me your thoughts, is like not every kind of treatment now needs a drug, right? Like there's lots of things you can do that maybe you need it, maybe you don't, but it seems to be like there's more of a movement to let's try some stuff before we just give you some sort of prescription for something. Is that fair to say?
No, it's very fair. My web guys tell me all the time, kind of give me my new data and how people find me. And it seems to be from a Google search term that Gray Matters is really coming up a lot with alternative as the word, alternative minded kind of people that are looking for change. And of course, you got to screen out some folks that are more foo-foo with some of the stuff they're thinking about and wanting. But alternative's a really good word, because it's really pointing to what else you got, kind of part of you. It's like, what else you got behind the medical model? And like you said nicely, yeah, certain, there are times when I have a partnering integrative psychiatrist that works with me, and you're darn right, I keep that for a reason, because there's just some cases I got to make sure we've got covered from that angle. So this isn't an either or thing, a pro con kind of thing. It's more about how do we give these alternatives, these ways of creating brain change to people. How do we do this more frequently, more readily, so people can get the help they need on this stuff? And yeah, luckily this population has the means to do that. And down the road, my goal and desire is to kind of take some of these models and make it more into a kind of a third world kind of environment to help trauma victims who don't have those resources. So that's another passion of mine too.
No, that's interesting, right? Because I think the thing that I've just kind of seen or read about anyway is some people fear getting addicted to something else, right? So you're just replacing one addiction with a different one, and that's not really better for anyone, really.
Oh yeah, and I could probably preach on this one for a while, but I think the word addiction has been a blessing and a curse. It's great that we're aware of the disorder, but there's a bunch of people like myself. Mark Lewis, this guy out in Amsterdam, has a wonderful book called Biology of Desire, and I'm kind of falling more in his camp over the years. He basically says, listen, biochemically, there's really not much of a difference between the process of falling in love and getting addicted to a chemical. There's a lot of out of body experiences and desires and cravings that seem disproportionate to the stimuli itself. And when you get down to it, we may not have enough data to say an illness or disorder. It may be more broadly based and better treated if we look at this as a disorder desire kind of process, which again, it's not just linguistic differences. I do think when you're looking at what it means for people, who want to get help but may not be ready to swallow that pill, I'm not sure I call that denial all the time. I think sometimes that's a good, hold on, let's see what we got instead of that word. I think that's a good kind of place to start. Yes, it may be denial and readiness to change factor, but it also may be that we've got somebody really willing, but needs an alternative means of getting the brain to heal itself.
Yeah, that's actually really quite interesting. But we're kind of coming to the end of the show. So let's close with mentioning where people can get more information about you and any other maybe links you want to mention, maybe some social media links.
Sure, no worries. You can definitely get the most info, in my opinion, from just my website, which is Gray Matters INTL, and that's Gray. We do the GREY spelling. I love it. GREYMATTERSINTL.com, and very good. Responsively, I think. If you want to reach out, and email is always the best given the travel, so you can shoot me an email at kevin@kevinflemingphd.com.
And your last name is Fleming.
That's right. KEVIN at KEVINFLEMINGPhD.com.
Perfect, Kevin. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time again to be on the show, and I look forward to keeping in touch with you, and have a good rest of your day, man.
I appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, too.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.